Welcome to the Burn Bag podcast. My name is Andrea Gunawala. I'm being joined by my co-host Ryan Rosenthal, and today we're so honored and delighted to be joined by Fiona Hill, Dr. Fiona Hill. Fiona is the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program. She is a former Deputy Assistant to the President and former Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council between 2017 and 2019. Between 2006 and 2009, she also served on the National Intelligence as a National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, and is the co-author of the seminal Putin biography, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Fiona, I got to know you a bit through the University of Chicago and an internship I did last summer. It's always great to see you. It's always great to talk to you. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, I'm really glad to be here, Andrea. Really nice to see you again.
Well, Fiona, I'm certainly excited for today's conversation. I have Mr. Putin on the bookshelf behind me. I am a Russianist myself, and so this really is a privilege for me. And so I want to begin today's conversation by talking about Geneva. Presidents Putin and Biden met at Geneva not too long ago. They've called it a productive and constructive meeting, but President Biden was criticized for even holding the meeting because it kind of legitimizes President Putin, who, at home is an autocrat. And so I just want to begin by getting your takeaways of the meeting. Was it actually productive? Are they moving towards some sort of agreement on, say, arms control or maybe cybersecurity? What do you think?
Well, one meeting isn't, really a sort of a testament to, whole policy direction, for example. I mean, we need to have meetings to move things along. Sometimes meetings do that. Sometimes just the actual fact of the meeting itself is mostly symbolic, which, to some degree, I think this one was. And, in some cases, of course, there can be major achievements at a proper summit if things have been properly prepared. And I think part of the dilemma that we had in looking at the Geneva meeting was people kept calling it a summit, which actually really it wasn't. It was more of a kind of an initial encounter for President Biden with President Putin. It's not the first time that Biden has met with Putin. He actually met with him several times when he was vice president as part of the Obama administration, and had a pretty famous, kind of meeting with him in 2011, exactly 10 years ago, in which they certainly had a lot of, back and forth between them. But of course, this is the first encounter with Biden as President Biden. Putin, of course, has been president in Russia for coming on to 21 years. So, in that instance, he's been around a long time. And this was really the problem for President Biden rather than for President Putin. He has a lot of baggage that went into that meeting on the US side that wasn't his, but he kind of had to unpack it or, perhaps carry it on. So there was the hangover from the Trump administration and the meeting between Trump and Putin in Geneva, not in Geneva, but in Helsinki in Finland, which everyone kept comparing this one to. And then the last time two US Russian presidents met in Geneva was actually Gorbachev and Reagan. So in a way, he also had that shadow of the Soviet, relationship hanging over this as well. And then there's the confrontational nature of the US-Russian relationship, which extends back beyond 2016 and the Russian interference in the presidential election to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, the starting off the war in Donbass, the shooting down of MH17, the Malaysian Airlines over, Ukrainian airspace in the course of all of this, and then the intervention by Russia into the Syrian civil war in defense of Bashar al-Assad. And all of those incidents, on top of many other things that we could probably spend all day going down the kind of whole list of things that have occurred, really put the US and Russia in a highly confrontational, highly charged, and really kind of precarious situation in the bilateral relationship. And also an incredible backlash in the US domestically against any kind of meeting between a US president and Russia, because back in the Obama administration, when Biden was vice president, the decision had been made to cut off ties with Russia, kick them out of the G8 and isolate them. And then over time, of course, that's proven to be quite difficult to maintain that stance because, of course, Russia has all kinds of relationships with other countries. And the Russians have this way of making their presence felt. You can't ignore them. You can't stick them in a box. You can't kind of just, pretend that they're not there, because of course they are. And, we've seen over the last several years, as I said, this whole litany of things that the Russians have done, from hacking into our election, both the physical systems and into people's private emails at the Democratic National Committee, Hillary Clinton, John Podesta, another of our advisors, criminals perpetrating ransomware attacks clearly from Russia, Russian operations to create persona on social media and, kind of fuel discord or inflame already fueled discord among Americans over contentious issues of race, different politics and cultural values, for example. Hit squads running around Europe and elsewhere, assassinating people from Russian opposition figures to former spies, and then, lots of collateral damage. In the meantime, sending militia forces, proxy forces into Syria and elsewhere. It just kind of goes on. And that's, kind of why on the domestic front in the United States, there's so much of a feeling, well, what on earth are we doing with meeting with Putin? But, kind of Russia remains an adversary and a competitor, and diplomacy is a tool for dealing with this kind of eventuality. We have to deal with China, similarly, where there's a real system threat and obviously an equally difficult relationship. President Biden and the current administration have resolved to kind of reinvigorate the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. So there are people out there meeting with Iranians who are extraordinarily hostile to the United States. And there's talk about what do we do with North Korea, for example. So when you think about this kind of totality of difficult relationships, and we've been meeting with the Taliban and talking about, we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan. That's what diplomacy is there for. It's a sort of a tool, part of statecraft, if you kind of figure out how to have these meetings and see what you can basically get out of them. But it's, one meeting is not sufficient to be able to tell what's going to happen. And we can, talk a little bit more about that.
So when we're talking about some of these meetings between, President Putin and President Biden, and President Putin's met with about 5 US presidents, between Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Putin and Biden. But in sort of the run up to this summit meeting, I saw a lot of the media, the news media was sort of treating this as if it was like this wrestling match, sort of like they had a lot of promotional material, like, Biden's going head to head with Putin and so on. And Fiona, you were certainly President Trump's meeting with President Putin, and you've certainly observed other presidential meetings with President Putin and so on. What is the nature of the personal diplomacy between these two presidents? Like, once these presidents enter the room, like, for example, we've talked about Reagan and Gorbachev when they met at Geneva. I think Reagan aide came up to George Shultz and was like, hey, should we cut this meeting short? And Secretary Shultz was like, are you kidding me? Are you crazy? You should be fired on the spot. Because that type of a rapport was so important. But is a rapport between our US presidents and President Putin and other Russian leaders, is that as important as we might think it would be from just the way the media is framing it?
Well, if you can have a genuine rapport that can move things in the right direction, then that can be valuable. But as we can see from the case of all of those meetings and encounters and relationships that you've outlined, that in itself is not enough. Look, President Trump tried to create a rapport with Putin. He kind of believed that their personal relationship, his own charm and ability to relate one-on-one to Putin would be sufficient to transform the relationship. Of course, it wasn't. There was far too much weight on the relationship, far too many problems for anything like that to make a difference. And if we look back to the Gorbachev and Reagan era, and then after that, to George H.W. Bush, who also met with Gorbachev in Helsinki, for example, and other leaders after that, Clinton, George W. Bush, President Obama, everybody has been trying for decades to find a way of transforming a kind of personal rapport into something meaningful in the US-Russian relationship. We've had resets, we've had all kinds of efforts to do something different, to change the trajectory here. And I think really the last time when a personal rapport did make a difference was Gorbachev and Reagan. And we could ask ourselves then, why was that the case? Well, let me just sort of say very quickly, that was because the Soviet Union and the United States sort of saw themselves at that point as equals, irrespective of the fact that we knew that the Soviet Union was in trouble. Ultimately, this was on the eve of its collapse, although, we didn't exactly know when Gorbachev and Reagan, met in that period of the late 1980s. But ever after that, Russia saw itself as the successor state to the Soviet Union on the losing end of history, a history that we were trying to write, back in the United States, in sort of a triumphal sense of we won the Cold War, kind of Gorbachev ended up losing a country, as well as his position. And everything after that was framed by this sort of sense of loss of country and loss of position for the Russians, and filled with grievance and resentment. And, that colored for a long time, all of their relationships, a sense of kind of being unequal. And in some cases, not so much for Yeltsin, but, for Putin coming after him, a sense of wanting to have revenge. And I think, what we see is Putin is really relishing the, well, hey, things aren't looking so good for you, are they? And we saw that in the press conference at Geneva. He was asked all of these questions and he turned it around every time, what we call whataboutism. Well, what about the United States? Well, what about this? You've talked about human rights here. You've talked about this. You've talked about that. Well, what about the United States? And you can see that he clearly relishes turning the whole tables around. The idea that the United States is overextended. The United States has failed in Afghanistan, just like the Soviet Union did. The United States has got all of these domestic problems. The United States looks like a failed state. This is kind of what he's saying, of course. And the United States is riven with domestic contradictions, and its economy hasn't been doing very well. And this is the kind of thing that Putin is trying to push back, because it's almost like a way in which he's been waiting for the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union to push that right back again. And I think Putin really relished the Trump period where the United States was at war with itself. And so he, was kind of quite happy to play into those wars and to kind of provoke more of a kind of a backlash, and to weaken the United States and to weaken Americans' own faith in the country and its institutions. So that's the dilemma that we have to deal with. Because at the same time that Putin wants to have the recognition of being a great power, as President Biden said, and a worthy opponent, and the kind of sense of a sparring partner and a competitor on the international stage, he also does kind of want to pay back that kind of sense of loss and humiliation and grievance. He can't, really help himself. So, that's kind of part of our problem here. And so a personal rapport won't really help that much with that. And I think Biden is actually the first president who's come in, not seeking a reset, not seeking to have a personal relationship, not talking about bringing their spouses, actually Putin technically doesn't have a spouse, kind of a families to sort of meet each other. I mean, that was a hallmark of Gorbachev and Reagan with, Raisa Gorbacheva and Nancy Reagan. And then, the meetings, Putin, at one point getting invited to the Bush family, compound in Kennebunk in Maine. All of that bon ami, or here, you come to my house and I'll come to your house and here's my wife, and, kind of all of this kind of thing. That's out the window. I think, what President Biden is trying to do is synthesize all of the ways in which this relationship has played out in the time that he has been observing it. It's been a long time in his case because of all of the prominence that he's had in US politics, and just try to find some kind of neutral ground here. He said himself, I don't trust this guy, we're not going to be friends. We're not going to be gazing into each other's, skulls and eyes and all the rest of it. Been there, done that. Let's just try to kind of find a way in which we can be professional and to try to take the edge off this confrontation here.
Fiona, you've raised so many crucial points in this response, and I kind of want to take a step back right now and talk about how we got here, understanding the man that is Vladimir Putin. And so in your book, you kind of lay out the various aspects of Mr. Putin, and you talk about, I'll just rattle them off for our listeners, but I really urge them to buy your book. It's the statist, the history man, the survivalist, the outsider, the free marketeer, the case officer. These are all interwoven personalities or aspects of Putin. And so, Fiona, are there any one of these kind of personalities that more dominate the others, or have we seen some become more predominant than others over time? Is he more of a survivalist in the beginning, given the craziness of the 90s, or is he always really leaning on his case officer personality?
Oh, thanks so much, Ryan, for the question, also for the book plug. Brookings Press will be very grateful to you if one or two people run out and buy it after this. I would say that it's actually right, as you're suggesting, that some parts of the aspects of his very multifaceted persona have become more prominent at different times, and perhaps with time as well. I would say that right now it's the kind of history man and the case officer that really kind of tend to predominate. And what I mean by this is, so Putin is somebody who's really steeped in Russian history. And he tries to kind of make himself a protagonist in Russian history, which of course he is. And, if he actually stays as Russian president until 2036, he'll be one of the longest serving Russian leaders in all history. Tsarist era, Soviet era. He clearly sees that as being part of his legacy. He also sees his legacy almost in an imperial sense, because he's always talking about the Tsars. In a way, he's become Tsar Vladimir. He's become kind of a monarch and autocrat. He's guaranteed by the constitution and pretty much little else. There's not really any checks and balances in the system. So it's a kind of a sort of quasi-constitutional monarchy, but without any of the constraints that, you normally associate with that. He is always kind of playing up, he benefits from being called Vladimir, like the great prince who was originally of Kiev, actually, who was the kind of founder of the original Tsarist dynasties, the kind of the Grand Prince of Kiev, who consolidated all of those initial early lands of Muscovy. He's always referring back to that. He refers back to usually somebody the Great all the time: Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, so we kind of go on, Alexander the Great. And when you go to the Kremlin and you go to the kind of antechambers of his offices and the places where he holds all of his meetings, they're very strategically placed busts and statues of the various great emperors and empress Catherine the Great. And so he's clearly presenting himself as a legend in his own lifetime, a historic figure who, is there protecting the state and reincorporating lost state lands like Crimea, for example, with the annexation of Crimea. There was a big shift in March of 2018 when he made the pronouncement of the annexation of Crimea. And if people want to go back and, pass and just read that speech that he gave, it was just a kind of a whole quick synthesis from his point of view of Russian history and the idea that Russia's always been persecuted by the West. It's always trying to put it down and needing its, kind of place in the sun kind of idea, and bringing back lost lands like Crimea, et cetera, et cetera. So that becomes part of his legacy as well. He's almost like the forebears of Russian Tsars and Tsarinas, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, consolidating Russia's position in Crimea, the Black Sea region, et cetera, the lands of what are now Ukraine. So that's History Man. I am part of history. I'm a historical figure, and that's going to be part of my legacy, because he's already thinking, kind of ahead about what comes after him, although it might be a long time before that happens if he's planning on staying around until 2036. So the second bit is the case officer, because this is what really distinguishes Putin from our other previous Russian leaders. He is, a product of the deep state in that Turkish sense of, the kind of people who are there behind the scenes that nobody ever sees. He rose up the dark corridors of the KGB, the Russian security services, to power, and he's adapted all of the tools of the trade to politics. I mean, some might argue they are the same tools of politics, how you learn to manipulate people, blackmail people, get ahead by, kind of leveraging all kinds of things. What's the difference between politics and, basically being a KGB agent? That's exactly what he would say. And, but, he's somebody who also was involved in black operations, in covert operations, subversion, and all of the kind of dirty tricks that you think of associated with the KGB going back to the 1970s. And he's made that the hallmark of Russian statecraft. So Putin, operates through proxy forces, covert actions, all these poisonings and assassinations, at times more so than he does through overt statecraft. So, when you think of, the favored tools of the Russian state at the moment, it's cyber operations. It's information warfare. It's all the kind of old style propaganda and, manipulation, and including assassination and, kind of basically getting incriminating information on people, the kind of thing that was the hallmark of a KGB operation, back in the day. And it's less through conventional diplomacy and, the overt military force, although that still remains important. And I don't want to say that doesn't. It's just that for Vladimir Putin, he's not constrained in any way. There are no checks and balances to stop him from thinking how ruthless and aggressive can he be. And that makes it a real problem for us dealing with him, because that's the dilemma for President Biden, who is a product of the actual state and has risen up through the front corridors of everything, coming up as a Congress, Senate, a vice president, and now a president. And everything he's ever done has been above board. I mean, he's a pretty straightforward politician. He's certainly seen every trick there is in the book, but he hasn't necessarily perpetrated every trick that there is in the book, the dirty tricks that people like Putin play. And although I think he's got Putin's measure, like other previous US presidents have had, he's not the ruthless kind of person that Putin is. And so we're always going to have to contend with the fact that Putin has this ruthless, aggressive streak, that he'll do whatever it takes to press Russia's interests. And we have to figure out how to blunt those effects and also change his calculus so that, he goes off into other channels and doesn't see always the need for subversion and coercion.
So in understanding Putin, especially with regards to the history man aspect that you've noted, is Putin truly like this unique figure in Russian history? I mean, you had mentioned all of these other leaders, the Tsars and so on. Are there any particular leaders, Russian leaders or Soviet leaders, who we might want to understand better to understand Putin? Like, for example, is Putin trying to emulate Brezhnev, for example? Like Brezhnev being like, I guess, the last real strong, per se, Soviet leader that I can think of, considering that the Soviets collapsed under Gorbachev and Yeltsin had all of his issues to deal with. Is he trying to emulate perhaps even a Stalin-esque aspect or so on? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are some that he wants to make sure he doesn't emulate, and actually Brezhnev falls into that in the later era, because Brezhnev, ended up, dying in office, like quite a few other late Soviet leaders. I mean, Gorbachev is still with us, actually, remarkably. I mean, Gorbachev's almost 90, at this point, or is he maybe even he did pass his 90th birthday? I mean, Gorbachev, has had an incredible longevity, not politically, but certainly, kind of in normal human natural terms, and he's been out of office a very long time at this point. But it was unusual in that regard, because Soviet leaders were always just sort of like dropping off with frightening regularity. And Brezhnev was also notable for kind of losing it a bit, certainly losing his edge, but becoming in the late life kind of a caricature and almost sort of incoherent. And that's the kind of, there was a real pushback when Putin came back to the presidency in 2011, 2012, against the idea of him being Brezhnev, the kind of period of stagnation, the idea that you could be, kind of the head of state in perpetuity. And people fused together pictures of Putin and Brezhnev, to kind of make that point. And in fact, I mean, Putin is going to be really old in anybody's terms. If he stays around till 2036, he'll be 84 years old. So, kind of Brezhnev is a cautionary tale as well. I mean, Putin is constantly reflecting on the people that he wants to associate himself with, but all of them have, slightly complex biographies. That's why he kind of has a bit of a grab bag. At different times, he's talked about Pyotr Stolypin, the reformist prime minister of Russia from the late Romanov period, the very, kind of last Nicholas II, the Tsar, which Putin rarely refers to, because, of course, Nicholas II didn't come to a particularly attractive end either from Putin's perspective. I think, kind of being shot, kind of in a basement is not quite what Putin would like to sort of see for himself after being overthrown and usurped. And Stolypin himself was, in fact, assassinated on a visit to the Kiev Opera House, just a few years before the revolution. And he pushed forward a whole series of reforms, but Stolypin was also quite brutal. I mean, he's known also for what was called Stolypin neckties, which he had a lot of opposition figures hung, for, rebellion. And he also dissolved the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament, several times. But his whole view was to transform Russia and, kind of stave off revolution. So at earlier points, Putin's looked at him and, tried to kind of cloak himself in the mantle of Stolypin, but then conveniently forgetting, some of the other aspects of Stolypin. Catherine the Great, the kind of empress who incorporated Crimea, incorporated the lands of, what are now Ukraine into the Russian Empire, had a correspondence with Voltaire, all kinds of other things that, Catherine the Great was renowned for, and culture and some of the unpleasant stuff as well. That's, not sugarcoat, kind of Catherine the Great either, but, being seen as a real European leader. Alexander, the Great, who emancipated the serfs. At different times, he's been interested in people like Nicholas I, who, ironically, lost the Crimean War to the Brits, but at different points was seen as, a really strong Tsar along the lines that you were suggesting there, Andre, about other figures. So Putin likes to kind of pick and choose. It's almost like, a bag of candy from which of these, kind of different leaders at different points can I delve into. And I think that one of the reasons why he, kind of keeps on sort of trying to sort of change his persona or change the things that he talks about is to avoid being too closely associated with any one leader, because there's always something in their biography that could be used against him. And the idea that his current presidency was going to be up in 2024, and still is technically, he has to subject himself to re-election, became kind of problematic, because 2024 will be the 100th anniversary of the death of Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, but also somebody who died in office after, surviving an assassination attempt, and then, kind of still dying from complications in that assassination attempt from a stroke. And you remember that Putin also famously banned the death of Stalin, the film, because of, all the sort of connotations about, the death of Stalin himself, kind of unexpectedly, in the chaos that ensued. So he's always trying to reinvent himself, use different kind of narratives to put himself in the best possible position. But I think he might be, somewhat leery of being too closely associated with any one of those figures. But for anybody who's interested in thinking about Russian history, it's about, kind of understanding how he uses all of these particular historical figures to basically push a particular narrative at a particular time. And just like, Ryan was asking, how has Putin changed over time? His use of historical figures has also changed over time.
I completely agree with, that entire kind of breakdown of how it works. And many analysts will kind of maybe take this, one-sided view of he's just a thug who seeks to enrich himself and his cronies. But as you've kind of laid out, it's far more complicated than that. But Fiona, I want to ask about the Russian people, right? Is Putin a popular leader? Does he have popular support? Because certainly many within Russia are Orthodox Christian, they are nationalists, they seek out a strongman leader, but that's certainly not the case, as we've seen with the popular support of Alexei Navalny. And so, it's just, I guess, very briefly, Fiona, is Putin popular? Does he have the support of the people?
And Ryan, you've really kind of touched upon, I think, a kind of a third rail in Russian politics at the moment, because Putin is a populist leader. And I think that Alexei Navalny has him running scared in some respects, though, of course, he would never say that. And you notice in the press conference after Geneva, he wouldn't say his name. They asked, what are you frightened of? Fear, that's nothing to do with it. Well, actually, I think he is concerned because as a populist leader, and if you're not really truly popular, as you're suggesting here, it means somebody else can outmaneuver you potentially by whipping up populist sentiment. And Alexei Navalny has had a lot of potential for that because, populists are renowned for railing against corrupt elites and, kind of creating us versus them. And what's interesting about Alexei Navalny and why he's been so dangerous and why they tried to poison him and now they've got him in jail is, he's a younger generation. He's very charismatic. He's handsome. He's very Russian. He's a bit of a Russian nationalist. He's got a heck of a lot of popular appeal, but even if it's not kind of, he's widely popular and got name recognition, a lot of people really admire him for his unbelievable bravery and willingness to take things on. But he's not asking for a revolution. He's not talking about sort of transforming the system. He's talking about getting these guys out. The corrupt kleptocrats, this elite around Putin, of Putin's guys, Putin's people, like Catherine Belton's book, that she's just, written, and giving everybody else a chance. So Alexei Navalny saying, well, I'd like to be president. And, why don't all these other people? I mean, he's, 20 years younger, more than that. and Putin 25 years younger, almost different generation completely. And, you know, there are a lot of people circulating around Putin himself inside of his own system who'd also like to have their own political mobility and don't want Putin hanging around to being Brezhnev and, you know, staying in power till 84 and, you know, all the rest of it. And they'd like kind of a chance at, some people like to enrich themselves. Others like political influence. Others would like to, you know, kind of just have a chance of, you know, maybe having some incremental change in the country. And the issue about Putin's popularity now is a really good one, because we have the Duma, the Russian parliamentary elections coming up very shortly, and Russian the ruling party, United Russia, Putin isn't really technically part of the party anymore, but it's still seen as a ruling party. They're not looking popular at all in polling. That kind of is sort of indicative of the fact that, you know, though Putin, fortunately for him, isn't, you know, kind of part of the party, so it's not an indictment of him, it actually shows that it's well under, you know, 30%, maybe 20%, some people seem to be 15% of, you know, real popularity of the party, so there's something wrong. And when you look at opinion surveys, people are very critical of the government, they're very critical of all kinds of government institutions, and less critical of Putin, because Putin is seen as sort of the symbol of the state. But a lot of all these kind of local elections and others, you know, suggest that, first of all, Putin's popularity is not very high in Moscow, and we've seen, you know, a lot of evidence of that. Not even very high in his hometown of St. Petersburg. And there's a lot of willingness to take him on and challenge him across the country. We saw a lot of protests in the Urals, in Siberia, the Russian Far East. And Navalny was running around trying to, you know, kind of whip up the opposition there to Putin, because a lot of people are just like anybody but Putin, which is something that Navalny was tapping into. So it's really hard to say now how popular Putin really is. And, you know, kind of it's the turnout in the election, you know, when they were trying to push people out for the voting in the referendum to essentially extend his presidential terms and to change the constitution, that to really pull out all the stops to get people out. They didn't want to vote to suppress because they wanted to have as many people out there as possible. Otherwise, the legitimacy of Putin would be under question. So he actually needs to have high turnout in presidential elections, and he needs to be able to show that he's still got some real genuine popularity, even if he has to force the issue, to have legitimacy in the system, because Putin is a populist and he's saying, I'm here because the people love me, the people support me, and I'm guaranteed by the constitution. But a lot of things are pointing to the fact that that might not be quite the case.
So you say all of this, you know, the need for Putin to try to maintain his popularity, the fact that he is a bit scared of Navalny, hence, you know, the poisoning and sort of the imprisonment. But are there really true cracks per se in the vertical of power in Putin as an institution? Like, is he getting weaker? Like, what's the deal with that? Because for someone like me, sort of like, you know, as a non-Russianist, I sort of see Putin as this eternal leader to an extent, that like, oh yeah, the election's going to come. He's going to win that easy. He'll be in power for as long as he wants. Why am I wrong? Am I wrong?
Well, you're actually not necessarily wrong, because he could pull it off. So this is kind of, it's one of these issues when everybody was looking at the Soviet Union and its, you know, viability, you know, back in the 80s. You know, when I first got to the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, 1987 to 1988, I was shocked by how fragile the place was. I mean, I came there thinking I was going to the other great superpower. I was an exchange student. And I got there and the whole place was literally falling apart. I mean, it was just glaringly obvious that the place was in trouble. But it actually could have gone on for quite some time. And I think that that's kind of, you know, the dilemma. Russia is never as strong and never as weak as it appears. And it has an incredible capacity for surviving. Getting back to Ryan's point about Putin as the survivalist, the whole country is a survivalist. And, you know, those who are in power in the Kremlin can muster a lot of resources, and including monopoly on power and a monopoly on violence, you know, to can't maintain a grip. And as long as he has the confidence and support, the security service and the whole system around him, and he stays well and healthy, and, you know, there's not some, you know, kind of major problem with the system, and, you know, kind of there's no one to really challenge him and, you know, kind of what he's doing, and he can keep on putting all the opposition away one way or another, you know, he could keep on going. No, but what could, you know, basically upset all of this? Well, in the past, when countries have been fragile like this, but, you know, also at the same time, you know, somehow incredibly able to keep on going, a war or, you know, an external shock, all kinds of things. What precipitated the the Russian Revolution was a long tail to that. But it was World War One, and the defeat in World War One, and the overextension of the military, and the kind of the backlash of people within the Russian Empire against the Tsar as a result of defeat in war. And the previous revolution earlier in 1905 was the same, defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. What happened in the Soviet period? Of course, there was the overextension in Afghanistan, there was all the economic crises, but it was also because there was an awful lot of ambitious people around Gorbachev, including Yeltsin himself, Boris Yeltsin, and other regional leaders in the former Soviet Union, who were also seeking power within the system. And they declared the Soviet Union dead. Kuchma, Shishkevich, and Yeltsin, basically Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia kind of getting together, and in the wake of a coup against Gorbachev's reforms and all kinds of other things going on, to basically just decide to unravel the whole thing. So Gorbachev got toppled, by a group of regional leaders. I mean, on top of lots of other things going on and great weakness in the system, etc. But it didn't have to happen like that. So you can kind of see that Putin, could at some point, there could be a group of people around him who decide, oh gosh, he hasn't got what it takes anymore. There's all these rumors all the time of, ill health. What if they were true? I'm not saying they are, by the way. But, what if he is sick? I mean, he's a wild card. What if he just has a stroke? What if he falls down a flight of stairs? There are all kinds of things that could happen. Clearly, with COVID and the pandemic, there was a massive concern about Putin. I mean, I've heard from some of the journalists who went out to interview him, kind of recently for the, for the NBC, that the camera crew and others, they had to quarantine for 2 full weeks. This is Putin, who supposedly, relatively recent, got a COVID vaccination. But, the pandemic's getting out of control. Kind of lots of people in and around him have got sick. What if he got sick? What if, like Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, he'd got sick? There's all these kinds of contingencies that, they can't factor in. And that's, he's the wild card in the system. He's both the guarantor of the future and, potentially the biggest risk for the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And Fiona, I want to move to Russia's foreign policy next as we begin to kind of round out this conversation. We've seen a lot of aggression or assertiveness by Russia in the past, basically 20 years, and, most, concerningly with Ukraine, with Georgia, now we have the cyber domain. But I think, many analysts ask themselves is what causes this aggression? Is it domestic stability, or are there more external factors that are influencing Russia's foreign policy?
It's both. Basically, Putin has to show he's strong at home and abroad, because all of those things are, he's tried to transform himself, over the years into international statesman, not just, international man of action. And, he has to be out there showing that he is the leader of great power, and that only he, Vladimir Putin, can, strut the world stage, and, has to outshine and show up everyone else. The big risk, of course, is China, because he can't really outshine and show up President Xi and China, given the, the massive rise of China, the weight of China on the global stage, the system threat that China poses. So in a way, he has to spar with the United States and show that he's relevant. It's kind of like he's almost trying to prove to the Chinese that he's worthy, not as an opponent, but as a worthy partner. Biden called Putin a worthy opponent, but he wants to show China that they're a partner and they're just as good as China, and they're a great power and one of the only true great sovereign powers. And that's, obviously a difficult thing to pull off, given, the relative size disbalance, the whole imbalance in that relationship with China. And I don't mean the size of the country, because Russia is bigger than any other country kind of in the planet, but certainly not in terms of population and in terms of its economy. And it may still, have an edge in its conventional nuclear forces, but not for much longer. And Russia also sees that China is moving into all of these critical domains that the Soviet Union, along with the United States, used to dominate. So conventional nuclear military forces, space. China's just put, men on the moon, dark side of the moon, going to Mars. China, really forging ahead into outer space, in, kind of inner space. in terms of satellites and, Chinese activity there. It's pretty major. China's now got these, global reach of its military forces. And then the cyberspace and the information space. And Russia really has to show it can dominate in all of those. And if it can't do it by overt means, then it should do it by covert means. And so I think, Russia is really taking pains to prove it's a force to be reckoned with in the cyber domain and in the information domain, because it has to compete with China for preeminence there. It's not, of course, turning things against China, it's all against us. But the more that we talk about China as the major threat in the cyber domain, Russia wants to show, no, sorry, it's us. We're the major threat in the cyber domain. They're very loud and showy in all of these attacks. And if they can't, kind of get our attention through solar winds and all these other, attempts to put our critical infrastructure in jeopardy, the ransomware attacks and the knowledge that these are cyber criminals operating from Russia is also extraordinarily helpful, because Russia can say, well, let's sit down at the table and we'll try to rein all of these in. But of course they won't, because these are also extraordinarily useful for them. So in some respects, Russia in that case is like an arsonist running around and kind of also being a member of the fire brigade, but because it gets attention to them and makes them relevant. So there's that kind of element of things about always staying in the mix, always being at the center of everybody's attention, always kind of being at the forefront of everything, the 4-alarm fire, the 5-alarm fire. And then, it's partly just so that they get China's attention in a positive way to them, so they can show that they are a sort of an equal player on the global stage. But, unfortunately, the US expense, because the biggest fear is having China, potentially think predatory thoughts about them as China thinks predatory thoughts about everybody else at this particular juncture.
So would you say, there's this goal in Russia to certainly show that it's still relevant, especially in the face of a rising China. Are China and Russia growing closer in terms of their relationship? And also just a brief follow-up to that extent, that might be a big follow-up actually, but is Russia truly a declining power, as some have termed it?
I'll just answer the last one first, because Russia's been in perpetual decline. And as Ryan, probably knows from all of his studies of Russian history, every history book he picked up was always talking about Russia being, sort of declining. Declining before it even emerged, in a way, through serfdom, the weakness of its economy, the fact that it was always raw materials based. It was either fur or salt, back in the day. It wasn't kind of renowned for its kind of massive breakthroughs in technology. It was always kind of fighting a rearguard action. That's kind of like the sweep of Russian history. But Russia also proved that it should never be counted out. Russia became an empire and, rolled back the Europeans. It defeated the Swedes, that were the kind of like, the biggest, power at the time at the Battle of Poltava. It kind of, didn't do too well in World War I, but in World War II, through sheer bloody mindedness and, horrible war of attrition and massive casualties, it emerged as one of the victors on the other side of that. Got hold of, the atom bomb. We know the, stories about, how that all came about, but made itself one of the great nuclear powers. And at all times behind the scenes, Russia remained and retained the same kind of weaknesses that it always had: raw materials, power, but also some degrees of innovation, but never even able to scale it all up. But an incredible ingenuity at trying to kind of make a lot out of nothing very much. Apart from lots of raw materials, a huge amount of land, all of those things can be, really played well. And I think Russia always plays a weak hand extremely well. And it makes mistakes, but learns from those mistakes and, tries to correct them. That's not to say that, kind of it's infallible, like, any other country. But Russia has just remarkable staying power. So there's that aspect of, thinking about Russia. And of course, now I've got myself a little bit diverted from the main thrust of your question. So, let's kind of say again about where we should take this in this, kind of final segment here, because I did kind of get myself a little bit diverted there about thinking about Russia's perpetual sense of decline and weakness. What was the other thing, Andre, that you wanted, and Ryan, that you wanted me to push on?
Well, it was more so, are Russia and China becoming closer?
Right. The closest aspect of it. Because I was going to go from there and thinking, well, I wasn't quite answering the question that you'd first posed. by saying that, this is kind of part of Russia's problem with China, is that showing that it actually has the muscle and the power, to hold its own, because they are becoming closer. And I think it's by necessity on Russia's part and on China's part, because Russia's proven extraordinarily useful. Russia has been a sort of a partner in crime, a partner, in pushing back against the United States, in testing out all kinds of methods of subversion, cyber and information warfare, that the Chinese might be able to, take a leaf out of the Russian playbook, all the disinformation about vaccines and the origins of the coronavirus. I mean, what China's done is, almost a kind of carbon copy of the kinds of things that Russia's done, although I would say this is all backfired for both of them in terms of, their own ability to handle that over the longer term. A lot of it has been framed by mutual antipathy towards the United States, but over the longer term, I mean, Russia's got to be as concerned as the rest of us about, its own perhaps inherent weakness, especially in the Russian Far East, the vastness of its border with China, and what if China ultimately had predatory thoughts? And I think that that's what Russia is trying to head off, because many Russian senior officials know that China doesn't think that highly of them, Chinese officials. I mean, they find them extraordinarily useful. This is a useful partnership. They don't show any sign right now of, on Beijing's part, of getting rid of this. In fact, this is great to have a, kind of a comrade in arms, but they're very much the lesser power in this. They're kind of like the secondary figure. And I think that that's kind of the real risk for Russia over the longer term. This is an unequal partnership. I mean, they were never going to, have a full-fledged strategic partnership with the United States, too many contradictions. But, in the past, there was a Sino-Soviet rift. At that point, it was the other way around. The Soviet Union was dominant over communist China. And now that's flipped. And, somewhere down the line, I suspect that a lot of the contradictions in the relationship will make Russia a little more eager to kind of loosen things and have a bit more strategic autonomy. But I just can't say when that will be, and I fear it won't be for a while, because this is very useful now for Russia and China to, basically band together and bandwagon on so many different issues at the United Nations, and pushing back about US sanctions, pushing back against US financial weapons, and the kind of the use of the dollar internationally, and we could go on. There's a lot of commonality in their kind of approach and desire to kind of roll back the United States.
Well, time certainly flies when one talks about Russia. Fiona, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a fabulous conversation. We learned a lot about Putin and about Russian policy. For everyone listening, please be sure to check out Fiona's work. She's got a very cool project up and coming, so make sure to stay tuned for that. Fiona, once again, thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Ryan. And thank you so much, Andre, as well. It was really great to talk to both of you.
Definitely. Thank you so much for joining us.